Today we'll be discussing the Hope Florida scandal with two of the investigative journalists, Jason Garcia of Seeking Rents and Lawrence Mower, now with the Houston Chronicle, who have covered what I think it's safe to say is one of the biggest political scandals in at least modern Florida political history. And it involved the highly irregular transfer of Medicare settlement funds to the Hope Florida Foundation. The center has been involved in the controversial transfer of those funds since the beginning, filing public records requests and later intervening in heretofore secret legal efforts to keep the Hope Florida grand jury presentment sealed. I'm going to be turning this over to Michael Barfield, who I think you all know. Michael has been a fixture at the center and the Florida Trident since we launched 5 years ago. Michael wears many hats. He has served as our resolute public access and litigation director since day one. He's an award-winning investigative journalist for the Trident and recently was appointed as the center's executive director. Michael will introduce our panelists and, as the center's litigation director, will explain our legal efforts in trying to kick loose the grand jury presentment. There is going to be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of today's Zoom. Simply type your questions into the Q&A feature should be at the bottom of your screen. And Michael will read your questions, which will be answered as time allows. Here's Michael.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to all who have joined us. A grand jury in Leon County spent months investigating what happened to $10 million in Medicaid settlement money. It heard witnesses. It finished its work. It wrote a report. We know that report exists. And today, not one person on this call, including the three of us, the panelists, are permitted to read a word of it. And nor is anybody in Florida that we're aware of, other than the few people that were the subject of the grand jury's investigation. That is what we're here to talk about today. And let me switch to Lawrence. Lawrence, you wrote at the time for the Tampa Bay Times, along with Alexandria Glorioso from the Herald, and some of the most consequential reporting Florida has seen that traced the millions of dollars from state accounts into committees that defeated the 2024 recreational marijuana and abortion amendment. And that reporting triggered the criminal investigation by the grand jury and ultimately changed state law. When you first saw the $10 million line in the Centene settlement, what made you curious about it to begin your reporting pursuit?
Well, it actually it started before we had any idea about the $10 million settlement. It really started with Alexandra, who was my reporting partner at the time and also wife. She wanted to write about this program called Hope Florida. And basically, during the legislative session last year, there was a bill by DeSantis to basically enshrine this Hope Florida program into law. And Alex was like, look, we need to write about this because the Republican legislators are holding it up. This bill isn't moving. We're into I think it was the third week of session and the bill wasn't moving. And, I was like, well, I'm tied up with other things. I was writing about insurance stuff. And, I'm like, no. She was like, no, we got to write about it now. This is a big political story. So her work was on finding out why this bill was stalled. I started digging into the program itself. And I found that, there was basically no evidence that this program actually worked. This program, Hope Florida, was designed it was kind of Casey DeSantis' signature initiative to wean Floridians off of state government services, like, cash assistance, SNAP benefits, things like that, and basically direct them to churches and nonprofits to basically fulfill that need for people. But, there was no evidence, literally no reports, no studies. There was nothing really that showed that this thing existed or was effective. And I started digging into this affiliated charity, the Hope Florida Foundation, and found that they hadn't filed their tax returns or done anything required of them under state law. And so we wrote a first story just saying, hey, this bill is stalled. In the legislature, why are Republicans holding it up? And it turns out Republicans had their own concerns about it. Well, from there, the House did, after our story published, the House did schedule a hearing for that bill. And in their bill analysis, it turned out that House Republicans also had these same questions. And so we wrote about that, how these same records hadn't even been turned over to the House, which is highly unusual. And so, DeSantis happened to have a press conference right after that. I think it was the same day that House analysis dropped. And, Alex asked the governor, hey, why isn't the Hope Florida Foundation filed its tax returns? And he just lit into her saying, we're working with the House on this stuff and all this kind of stuff. And Alex and I kind of turned to each other afterward and said, something's up here. We're kind of onto something. And from there, it became this big Tallahassee mystery. What exactly was going on with this charity? The charity was supposed to be keeping its minutes. It hadn't. And then all of a sudden, we got a copy of one of the meeting minutes. And in that meeting minutes, it said that the Hope Florida Foundation had accepted $10 million through a long-standing settlement with the state. And from there, it was kind of off to the races. We were like, well, first of all, that's not even legal. These kind of settlements by law are supposed to go to the legislature or to the appropriate trust fund, which obviously didn't happen here. And so that really piqued our interests. We had no idea where that money was coming from. And at that point, the House also was very intrigued about, hey, where did this money come from?
And that led to the House committee led by Representative Andrade to begin some hearings ultimately and making some requests of Florida agencies about that. And both you and Alex covered that extensively. And tell us what ultimately happened with the House committee and its report.
Yeah, well, the House committee did dig into it. They held hearings, including by some of the officials with the Hope Florida Foundation, sworn hearings, which is highly unusual for the legislature. What turned out is that $10 million was part of a settlement with a Medicaid contractor called Centene. And Centene had gone around the country basically settling lawsuits for overbilling states for Medicaid prescriptions, basically. And this was
how much money did Florida get altogether from that settlement?
$67 million. And DeSantis had described this after this kind of came to light. DeSantis said that this $10 million was a cherry on top of what the state was owed by Centene. But my wife, Alex, got a copy of the original settlement from 3 years earlier that showed no, the original settlement was for $67 million. It was not for $57 million. It was for 67. And all of that money was owed to state taxpayers. And what we found is that what the state had done, what the DeSantis administration had done, was route that money to the Hope Florida Foundation. And the Hope Florida Foundation, in turn, immediately turned it over to two basically 501c4 nonprofits. These are organizations that can give political money, but they don't have to disclose their donors. And they basically had given this money to these two nonprofits, which in turn immediately gave it to a political committee controlled by James Uthmeyer that was intended to defeat the ballot initiatives in 2024, the abortion and marijuana ballot initiative. So basically what the state had done, what the administration had done, is essentially, as Alex Andrade describes it, use the Hope Florida Foundation to launder this money from the state coffers, from the state settlement, all the way to a political committee to be spent on political ads.
And at the time, James Uthmeyer was the chief of staff for the DeSantis administration.
That's right. And now he's attorney general.
Was appointed as attorney general.
Mm-hmm.
And let me switch to Jason Garcia with Seeking Rents. and his long-running work on how money moves between the legislature, political committees, and nonprofit organizations. I should put nonprofit in air quotes. Good morning, good afternoon, Jason. You've been writing about this machinery for years. Was Hope Florida a departure, a one-off, or was it the system working the way it normally does?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say this idea of using a C4 to essentially convert public money, Medicaid money, legal settlement money into political money, money for campaign ads, essentially, that is unusual. I'm not aware of an exact parallel situation, but we have seen C4s used this way in political campaigns, and we have also seen this kind of similar using of intermediaries to mask money out of the administration. And I'll give you just a couple examples to kind of articulate what I mean. So probably the last big scandal before the Hope Florida scandal, big political scandal in Florida, was what folks might know as the ghost candidate scandal. And the very short version of that is during the 2020 elections, there were 3 battleground races for the state Senate, for the 40-member state Senate. In all 3 of these races, these no party affiliation candidates qualified for the ballot. They paid the qualifying fee and then never did anything else. They never set up websites. They never showed up to events. They never did any campaigning. But they were suddenly the subject of a more than $500,000 advertising campaign, pitching them essentially as spoilers to the Democratic candidates in those races. And in that case, we ended up spending about a year tracing a lot of the money and stuff and people involved in that. And we learned that, for instance, much of it was orchestrated by consultants who had 3 clients in Florida at the time: Florida Power and Light, Florida Crystals, and Mosaic. But one of the things we learned is that money used in the advertising, they passed through, it was at least 2, and I believe it was 3 different C4s before they actually spent it, right? Including one, by the way, linked to Associated Industries of Florida, one of the state's big business lobbying groups, which is interesting because in the case of Hope Florida, one of the C4s they used as an intermediary was controlled by the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the other state big business lobbying group, right? So we have seen C4s used to not only mask the sort of origin of money when it appears in a campaign, but also to like really daisy chain it, to make it, on the off chance that someone figures out where it came from the first step, you end up just at another C4, right? But similarly, where we have also seen something like this out of the administration itself is the Hope Florida piece of this, the $10 million, was actually part of a much larger effort to use state resources to campaign against the 2 amendments that Lawrence mentioned. The Amendment 3, which would have legalized recreational marijuana in Florida, and Amendment 4, which would have overturned the state's near total abortion ban, right? Altogether, and this is Alex and Lawrence did some wonderful reporting around this too, we have found that the DeSantis administration essentially siphoned off nearly $40 million in public money from various sources to use to fund advertising against those 2 ballot measures. And one of the things we learned in the reporting for that is they would often not use C4s to mask the sort of the chain here, but contractors and then use subcontractors under them that nobody from the public could see. So you would see, for instance, the political committee that James Uthmeyer was chairing was using a number of vendors on the campaign. The state was ultimately paying those same vendors, except it was doing so as subcontractors. You only ever saw on public records that were available in real time often completely unrelated vendor. So you could not link the 2. So there is a very extensive history here, or pattern here, of finding ways to obfuscate the source of money that is being used to influence elections.
And in terms of that structure, clearly it's designed to hide the ball until after the election is over. Is that the ghost candidate scheme was done that way, and this too was schemed out this way to impact Amendment 3 and Amendment 4?
Yeah, I would say it's often done to hide it at least until the election is over. It's often designed to hide it in perpetuity so nobody can ever figure it out. It's just in the case of the ghost candidate stuff, we had access to, subpoenaed records because of a criminal investigation and because of leaked records out of a dispute between political contractors working on this. And then the Hope Florida and sort of the larger sort of administration effort against Amendment 3s and 4, we had like public records laws to help us. We had like dogged reporting by folks like Lawrence and Alex. So, but yeah, I would think a lot of the time the goal here is for nobody to ever learn about it, not just at minimum until after the election, but ideally never.
Yeah, we still
Well,
had records requests outstanding. I mean, basic stuff like the Department of Education still never turned over their contracts to do this work, to do this political advertising. We just never got it.
Lawrence, who put the Hope Florida donation of 10 million in the settlement draft? It was not in the initial draft from what I recall. Who put it in there, and what does that show about the timeline of the insertion into that process?
Yeah, the timing of this is interesting because Centene had been doing these settlements for years and had actually reached out to Florida about this. I believe it was in early 2021 and said, "Hey, we want to settle. Here's a draft settlement." And it was to the penny, the dollar amount was exactly the same as what the final settlement was. But Florida, for whatever reason, they had some stated reasons, but they did nothing on it until I believe it was September of 2024. And that timing is really important. That's late in the election cycle. You know, the election was coming up for these amendments, and all of a sudden you see the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which reports to the governor, uh, come in and say, "Hey, we want to settle now." And the initial settlement had no mention of the Hope Florida Foundation. It was just $67 million. Notably, Florida Kid Care, which is provides health insurance for poor kids in Florida, was one of the parties to the settlement. They would have gotten some of this money. They were taken out of the settlement. Um, what was added in was initially the ACA introduced a $5 million donation to the Hope Florida Foundation in it. I believe the next day was increased to $10 million. And, you know, who was in charge of ACA at the time? That was Jason Wida, who's the current chief of staff for Governor Ron DeSantis. Um, and so there seemed to be something going on behind the scenes. I mean, was this why settle this now? Why settle this in September so late? Why add this in? And, we got the records, the correspondence between Centene, again, which is I think it's a Fortune 50 company. It's one of the largest companies in America. And their primary job is handling Medicaid for various states. They were very reluctant to sign off on this agreement. They kept going back and forth, wanting assurances from Florida's attorney general about this 10 million. So they kept adding in provisions saying we want the attorney general to be a party here. And it was very interesting to see that they clearly had some reservations about this because, it can this settlement money be used for a charity, which was what the Hope Florida Foundation was at the time? Uh, that was a big question, clearly.
Yeah, and if I can just sort of jump in on the timing, the other thing that's interesting to note. So, as Lawrence said, this proposed settlement just kind of sat on a shelf for years, basically, before like suddenly being ripped off the shelf in very early September 2024, and this Hope Florida idea popping up. The exact same thing we know from public records. That's the exact same time that other state agencies, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Children and Families, the Department of Education, all suddenly lurched into action on advertising against these amendments themselves through these public service announcements. This all happens simultaneously. So even though, we don't have sort of a public explanation from the administration as to why it sat around doing nothing for forever on this settlement, and then suddenly it became like an urgent priority. But we do know that it was simultaneously very urgently working on these advertising campaigns where this money ultimately sort of ended up a part of.
Have either of you seen any prior situation where state coffers were used for political purposes like this?
Yeah, I can tell you on
Yeah.
on the scale, this is unprecedented. There's never been anything like this. There are often stories about, an agency sending some sort of communications related to a ballot measure that, is debatably advertising or something like that. But I mean, we are talking about anybody who turned on their local news in October of 2024 was just hit with an avalanche of campaign style ads paid for by Florida taxpayers that were implicitly targeting these two amendments. And that there has never been anything like that in Florida history. Certainly not in the 25 years I've been paying attention to this stuff.
Yeah, that is definitely unprecedented. And I'll add that, it's not unusual for governors to campaign against ballot initiatives. That's happened for decades, I mean, I think Bob Graham campaigned against, you know, um, recreational gambling and stuff like that in the state. And, what they did though is they set up a separate, campaign fund to do it. They use their own resources. They use the bully pulpit. Okay, that's allowed, but directing state money like this, especially in secret, I mean, all of this was done in secret. Even the Centene settlement, DeSantis is certainly someone who, will trumpet every major action against, big corporations and stuff like that. And any win he can get on things, I mean, he's not shy about these kinds of things. They kept the Centene settlement completely secret. Every other state but one, Georgia, publicly announced their settlements with Centene, and he never did. It had to be pried out by Alex Andrade's committee.
And it's
Let's
important
shift to
just to add real quick to not to get too far afield, but it's important to remember the governor also did that, right? He also set up a political committee and then leveraged donations from private businesses and interests with business before the state to donate to that. And I'll just give you one quick example. Philip Morris, the big tobacco giant, gave $500,000 to one of these committees set up to oppose these amendments. A few months later, lo and behold, it got a tax break from the DeSantis administration. So all of that kind of like conventional stuff that a lot of folks might find objectionable was happening in addition to all of this unprecedented stuff.
Also, the hemp manufacturers also,
Right.
gave a lot, and of course, I believe it was DeSantis vetoed the bill that would have regulated the safety of those products. These are products you can buy at gas stations and other non-medical marijuana places.
Yeah, and I think it was Jim DeFede of CBS Miami that got
Hmm.
text messages from like hemp executives and lobbyists saying like, okay, now we've promised to raise $5 million for the governor's amendment campaign in exchange for this veto. So like, I mean, a lot of this stuff was really sort of brazen.
very coordinated timing at the last minute of realizing that there was money out there that somebody wanted to give Florida and in terms of a legal settlement. Let's shift to Andrade's committee. Andrade was pretty clear. He made the accusations that after his investigation, he concluded the House committee investigation that it was both wire fraud and money laundering. And then the referral to State Attorney Jack Campbell in Tallahassee. Lawrence, why did the House probe stop where it did and get us into there and on into the grand jury process?
Well, what Rep. Andrade said is that it stopped because they found enough to turn stuff over to state and federal authorities. He also gave stuff to the FBI. Um, and this was kind of a question that a lot of people had at the very beginning is like, are you allowed to use federal Medicaid money like this? I mean, keep in mind, I mean, this is a federal program where that requires the state to pay back a share of Medicaid money. In this case, the state did owe money back to the feds out of the 67 million. And we had former federal prosecutors on the record, including people who are involved in crafting the federal money laundering statutes, saying, yeah, this is definitely enough to open an investigation. This does appear to be, illegally using, federal Medicaid money. But Andrade turned it over to the feds and to State Attorney Jack Campbell's office, and Jack Campbell basically he opened an investigation into it. He confirmed that there was an active investigation. We reported that, and a grand jury was convened, a statewide grand jury, or not a statewide grand jury, a regular grand jury. But this is a grand jury that basically, the first grand jury involved in investigating the state in decades. This was a pretty extraordinary event, and he ended up, I mean, as Alex and I and my colleague Justin Garcia at the Tampa Bay Times reported we staked out the courthouse. We found we got witnesses going in and out of the courthouse, people who were involved in this. We reported testified to this grand jury, and essentially what we understand now is that the grand jury did not issue an indictment. That was one of their options. They could have indicted people in this, but they chose not to do that. And instead, they chose to issue a public report known as a presentment. This is a situation in which the other grand juries have done this. And in this case, the grand jury, this is a tool basically for the grand jury to say, we didn't find anything criminal, but what we found, we think the public should know about. And there have been a lot of these issued over the state over the years. And so that's kind of where things sit now.
And when was Uthmeyer appointed Attorney General as it relates to the timing of the grand jury process?
This would have been last year, right?
Yeah, October of 25, I believe, is when the grand jury convened.
Yes. And Uthmeyer was the Attorney General? The months blur together. Was he appointed this year or last year? I can't even remember at this point.
I think he was sworn in February 2025.
Okay, so yeah, he was Attorney General last year. So yeah, this is obviously a bit of an awkward situation. A member of the state cabinet, like the Attorney General is, had not been basically subject to a grand jury investigation. I think Steve Bosquet reported this since the 80s, I believe. It'd been something like 4 or 5 decades since this had happened.
And Uthmeyer has publicly said this is a nothing burger, but also said he's not sure he can comment on questions that have been posed to him by reporters about, are you trying to block the presentment being available to the public? What I want to do is try to focus on what you were able to find out about the presentment, the records request to the state attorney, and the assertions of confidentiality, and any knowledge you may have about the legal proceedings.
Well, we had heard pretty soon after what we believe the presentment was issued, that we had heard from sources that this was the grand jury's conclusion, that they were issuing this presentment. When we asked the Attorney General, like right after that, I mean, he was having a press conference in Tallahassee, and we asked him about it, and he did not deny that there was a presentment. And everything we've learned is that, yeah, there is a presentment. We requested this stuff. You guys, probably know more about the behind the scenes legal proceedings. You guys, I believe, broke the story that there was a presentment. We understood that there was a presentment, but Michael, I think it was you who actually broke that news. We couldn't get it into the paper, but you could, and you did. And where things are now is that what we understand is that, basically the way these presentments work is that people who are named in these reports as potentially having done something wrong, they're given a copy of the report, and then they're allowed to petition a judge to have, those portions redacted. They can ask to redact these things. And Alex and I dug deep into the history of these reports. We can't find really any examples of these kinds of presentments being redacted in any significant way, because ultimately a judge is like, I'm not going to silence a grand jury here, for this. And but nevertheless, you can appeal the judge's decision. If the judge says, hey, I don't find anything here is worth redacting, or suppressing the report in total. But the parties can appeal that. And in this case, there could be a number of parties involved, and they could all file appeals. And this thing could be dragged out for more than a year, and notably dragged out until after the election. And, it would hardly be a surprise if that's the strategy going on here.
Yes, and just for the audience information, under Florida law, a presentment naming an individual, or in this case, possibly an entity like Hope Florida, Centene, et cetera, uh, when a presentment is returned by the grand jury saying we made these findings, we're making recommendations, et cetera, anyone named in the report has a 15-day window to move to seal that or expunge that portion of the report that relates to them if they believe that it's inaccurate or false. And it's a very high burden historically. There's about my research, about a dozen cases of grand jury challenges to grand jury presentments over the years. Um, and it's a high burden for a public official or anyone who's the subject of a presentment to meet that burden. It almost always results in a significant portion of a presentment being revealed to the public eventually. In 1977, there was a grand jury presentment that the Florida Supreme Court looked at, and they treated the media and the press as a proper participant in a proceeding to be a counterweight against those who would like to keep it secret. And in that case, after the Trident confirmed that a presentment did exist and that there were proceedings underway, judicial court proceedings underway to challenge the grand jury's report, we moved to intervene. We then got an order from Circuit Judge Lee Marsh in Tallahassee, granting our motion to intervene, but with some limitations. And then Judge Marsh clarified that order about a month ago and indicated that if any appeal is taken from the final order entered by the court, that the state attorney would have to give us notice within 2 days of that appeal being filed. To date, we've not received any notice. I just spoke to the state attorney's office yesterday and indicated, renewed the request. Still got nothing, but an acknowledgement that they will comply with all orders of any court. So this sets up the possibility that, and likelihood, based on the information that we've learned, that a final order has been entered by Judge Marsh, and the party is now appealing that order and also separately appealing the direction by Judge Marsh that the state attorney provide the center and the Trident with notice within 2 days of that appeal being filed. Lawrence, how unusual is this level of secrecy over a court proceeding and a grand jury presentment in your experience?
Well, for a legal proceeding, it's highly unusual. I mean, courts are open to the public. That's how they operate in Florida. I mean, you can look up court records, even criminal court records and arrest reports and things like that online for most counties in Florida. In this case with presentments, what we found is that there have been cases in the past where, like you mentioned, media outlets were allowed to intervene and become a party to the case. These often in these kinds of situations, we don't know that there's even a presentment being issued or even a grand jury going on. So it's kind of hard to intervene. But in this case, I mean, we were there when the grand jury was literally going on. We were talking, we saw people coming in and out of that courtroom. So it wasn't like this was a secret that this was going on or that there was even a presentment issued. And so, yeah, it's highly unusual.
Jason, thoughts on the secrecy?
Yeah, it's I'm not a criminal justice reporter, so I don't have like a huge history with grand jury proceedings. Grand juries generally are there's a lot of secrecy around them, but presentments generally you don't have much of an issue obtaining them. And this is another one, Michael, well. There was a really critical presentment to come out of. There was a scandal in Hardee County involving a couple of members of the Florida legislature, where, again, the grand jury ultimately concluded that nothing criminal had happened, but was very critical of specifically these legislators' conduct and all of that. And we were able to get that report without any real issue. That report is available to anybody who wants to read it today. You can know just what Jamie Grant, Jason Broder, and Ben Albritton had to do with this Hardee County Industrial Authority scandal. So, I mean, there's a long history of these grand jury presentments being available, and it's important to remember that they're meant to be public, right? Like, this is why the grand jury writes them. It's not meant to be like a letter to the people that they did wrong, saying, hey, try and do better next time, right? They want the public to know what they have learned. So these should be public. They have been public in the past.
Every person named in that grand jury presentment, including James Uthmeyer, the appointed Attorney General, who is the highest legal officer in the state, could end this tomorrow by stating publicly that they do not object to its release. Lawrence, Jason, has anyone done that?
Not that I know of. And frankly, like the Attorney General has said that he can't even talk about this, but I don't believe that's actually true. That's not the way I read the statute. I mean, he could talk about what actually happened here. He's never really fully explained his role in this. He was intimately involved, we know, that thanks to, Representative Andrade's committee, that he was intimately involved in the actual diversion of the money to some of these 501c4 groups. And so he's never really explained that. He says he can't talk about it, but, I think he could.
He hasn't even, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, fellas, he has not even been willing to answer the question about whether or not he's objecting to the release. He won't even address that question, despite multiple times being asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he can certainly say that. He can certainly say, no, I have no problem with any report that may exist being released. But that's not happened.
Yes, and I've spoken to several lawyers. There's nothing that prohibits him from answering questions about his role in the underlying saga, regardless of what may exist in the grand jury's report or the legal proceedings. But to date, he has not done so.
Yeah, and can I add to that point a little bit too? Is just to remember sort of how the goalposts have sort of moved on this too, because I don't know, Lawrence, you might remember this too, but very early on this, Alan Lawson, the former Supreme Court justice that now works at a law firm that gets quite a bit of work from the state, wrote an op-ed defending James Uthmeyer, and I'm paraphrasing here, so don't hold me to the exact words, but basically said, from what I can tell, James Uthmeyer had nothing to do with any of this. And then we learn that not only, in addition to being the chief of staff and just the preposterous idea that they would move $10 million through a nonprofit that was personally important to the governor and the governor's wife into a political campaign that was like personally important to the governor, the idea of just the preposterousness of pretending that the chief of staff wouldn't have known about this. We now know that from these text messages that he was coordinating the money as it moved through there. He played at least some role in the coordination of the money as it moved through the Hope Florida Foundation, through these C4s to the political committee that he chairs. We also know that he was involved in early talks around the settlement before he was chief of staff. He was the general counsel in the governor's office. We have calendar entries showing him meeting with the Centene litigation team about this stuff. So he shows up at the very beginning of this, the middle of it, and the end. And so the talking point that he had nothing to do with any of this quickly changed to he had nothing to do with any of it starting September 2024 is what it. So we've seen the goalposts move, which makes it, just from my perspective, a little hard to sort of like take his word for it. I would much rather see what the grand jury who heard sworn testimony has to say about it.
Before we get to Q&A, I wanted to ask both of you, what does it do to the reporting beat when the accountability record itself becomes unreachable behind closed doors, secrecy?
Well, I mean, this was a theme throughout the Hope Florida saga because DeSantis would never explain it and the administration wouldn't release records about any of this stuff for months and months. And so we made that the story. Where did this money go? What was the 10 million spent on? We wrote stories on that. And frankly, a lot of people, especially Republicans in the legislature, became extremely interested in what happened to that. And that helped pry things open. but it does obviously dampen the reporting. I mean, it's like, if you have a government that won't follow the law and release public records, obviously, I mean, you can go back and look at like the Jeb Bush days. Like I'll go back and read old clips about old scandals and stuff, and you'd have a scandal break on a Monday. Jeb Bush's administration would release records by Friday. That would you could find that. And what you're telling me that they can't do that today, they obviously can do that today. They deliberately withhold records to try to squash the story.
Yeah, it was easier to get records even out of the Scott administration, and we thought that was darkness.
Yeah, and
Times of dark.
one thing I would add to that too, like just to think through it, like one of the challenges in reporting is to try and get past like kind of a one side said this, the other side said that, and like without sort of being able to show where exactly the truth is, that is somewhere in the middle. And what withholding this stuff, keeping it confidential does is it keeps it in that area where you can tell your side or your people that this is all nothing. This is just take my word for it, right? And this is just the guys who don't like us trying to muddy the water. And it avoids ever getting any finality to that and proving, who is telling the truth and who is not. And so that makes, just as if you think of reporting as an exercise in truth telling and getting to what the actual truth is, not just what people are saying, but what actually happened, what is true, this is designed to make that impossible.
Let me turn to some questions from the chat. From Martin. Question: at any time, did the House ask the Auditor General or the Office of Public Policy and Government Accountability to look into this? And if so, did they?
I don't believe so. I mean, Opaga does kind of like more like analyses of programs and stuff like that. They don't, I mean, nowadays they don't do so much investigating. What was it? The General Counsel? Is that what, was that the other one cited?
Office of Public Policy and Government Accountability.
I think
Government
JLAC, the Auditor General, was the other one.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I don't know. I don't think they did. I don't think they did.
I'm not aware of, and a lot of this was moving very quickly. I mean, the committee in this case was doing a lot of its own investigating, like calling witnesses and, like Lawrence said, sort of swearing them in and stuff. So from the perspective, there wasn't necessarily the need to use like the auditor's office if the committee was going to do that kind of work itself, I think. So I'm not aware of them ever, asking to bring in an auditor or anything like that.
Second question is from Demetra. Was it even legal for governor, chief of staff to be entwined in those organizations? Isn't there an advocacy firewall when it comes to government functions and funding? Lawrence, I think you touched on that earlier, and Jason, but give me a more direct answer if you could.
Well, I think it's legal for him to chair a political committee. Soliciting donors while on the job, which we didn't quite get into that with this whole scandal. I mean, there has been reporting by NBC News that Uthmeier and people in the governor's office had solicited donations while on the job. That doesn't seem to be following state law, but I don't know that really was the situation here.
This is a really interesting question because we have a law on the books or collection laws that are sometimes known as the Little Hatch Act. That the very sort of gist of it is designed to prevent public officials from using their official positions to interfere in elections, and arguably that was happening all over the place during these campaigns against Amendment 3 and 4. And there was lawsuits. There was a lawsuit filed, I believe, by Amendment 4. Sort of accusing the DeSantis administration and some of its senior officials, and I think they zeroed in on the AUKUS secretary specifically, accusing them of breaking this law prohibiting the use of official resources in your official office to interfere with elections. And the DeSantis administration took the position in court, or this might have been, actually, this was the Attorney General's office, if memory serves, that this law didn't apply to the governor and his top appointees, that they were exempt from this like important sort of public corruption law, right? And now, the court never got to that. The court just essentially did not resolve the case. It rejected the case on procedural grounds. I bring all that up. The legislature, after so much of this had come out, after Lawrence and Alex had done so much great reporting on the Hope Florida stuff, the legislature passed a law passed legislation really strengthening the Little Hatch Act, taking away the defenses the DeSantis administration tried to use when it declared itself exempt, and the governor vetoed the bill.
Great memory. I totally forgot about that. Yes.
Yeah, I do remember that now. Um, what was, this is another question. What was then Attorney General Ashley Moody's role in signing off on the settlement deal uh, without some of the safeguards that her office itself raised during the process, as I recall?
Moody herself, we don't know. She's never answered questions about what exactly her involvement was. The record, we got all the emails or whatever the Attorney General's office would release. The emails between the Attorney General's office and the other parties, like Centene and ACA and stuff. And it showed that her chief deputy, John Gard, was the one who was kind of handling all this. And John Gard was, ACA initially asked them to basically handle the entire thing. Like, you're the party that is going to handle this, settlement if there's a dispute over the settlement. And the Attorney General's office said, John Gard said, no, we're not. We're going to distance ourselves from this. We'll sign it, but we're not going to say if there's a dispute that we're the ones responsible for this. ACA reached the settlement. ACA, the Agency for Healthcare Administration, is the one who will defend this thing in court if it reaches that point. But they did sign off on it as well as other parties in the administration, including ACA.
And usually there's a much more detailed, rigorous process for much smaller sums of money when a settlement is signed off on. It goes through a rigorous process. Another question is, could a new governor and a new president order the FBI and/or FDLE to investigate the Hope Florida matter, or would the applicable statute of limitations have expired? I don't know the answer to that question. If either of you have but the statute of limitations would likely expire within the next year or 18 months based upon my 4-year limitations.
I'm not aware of anything that would stop that from happening. But like you said, I think it would be very unusual. Generally speaking, you don't want the governor ordering the launch of investigations, right? It's just like bad practice to begin with for the investigation to start that way. And like you said, statute of limitations will pretty quickly come into play with a lot of this stuff.
Question from Martin. How much did Florida taxpayers have to pay back to the federal government for the Medicaid share of the $10 million?
That's a great question. And that's been one of the central questions throughout this whole thing. So Medicaid funds about 60%. The federal government funds about 60% of Medicaid, and the states kind of handle the other 40%. And I was literally just texting my wife, like, how much did the state owe? I couldn't remember. But this was one of the central questions, because DeSantis, the way he and the administration described this settlement is that, the state only owed the actual settlement was only $57 million. And in that way, when states do get settlements involving Medicaid money, they do have to pay back the feds their usually about 60% share. And the administration had been saying, the settlement was only $57 million, that $10 million was a cherry on top. And if that was true, the administration would pay back the feds based on 60% of $57 million. However, that's not what they did. They paid back the federal government based on the full $67 million. And that wasn't something that came out until very late. It might have been this year, actually, in one of the hearings involving the current ACA secretary. She was up for confirmation. And, she said they did that out of an abundance of caution. But of course, the original settlement was $67 million. They just happened to divert $10 million of it somewhere else. That remains Medicaid money, and that's what the state ultimately decided. The $10 million is Medicaid money.
And just think about how that ties into what we were talking about earlier about hiding records as long as possible to try and avoid getting resolution to key questions like this by delaying sort of the acknowledgement of exactly how much they repaid the feds, it allowed the DeSantis administration to continue making the claim that this 10 million wasn't part of the settlement. This was, as Lawrence said, a cherry on top. You told the federal government it was part of the settlement, but based on what you paid them back. But we didn't find that out until, a year later, as Lawrence said.
What was the role of Jeff Aaron and Mo Jazzle in the Hope Florida saga? And is Jeff Aaron still legal counsel for Hope Florida?
The Hope Florida Foundation, I
Yes.
believe so. I mean, I haven't checked in recent months, but he was the general counsel for the Hope Florida Foundation. That's the charity that got the 10 million. And I mean, the records that Rep. Andrade showed that he, found that he was very involved in the diversion of the money. He had advised, I believe his name was Jeff Hay. He was the chairman of the board, the Hope Florida Foundation board, to accept this $10 million. Josh Hay, thank you. It feels like a lifetime ago. Josh Hay, to approve this money and to disperse it without board approval. Josh Hay testified in Andrade's committee that that I was advised on the advice of counsel that it was okay to do this, and was it okay to do that? That remains a big question, because there were all kinds of things going on with the Hope Florida Foundation board that, I mean, was clearly not proper, and Josh Hay and Jeff Aaron have admitted they were not proper. The other question was about Mo Jazzil. Mo Jazzil, when we started basically raising hell over this, the state hired, or the charity hired Mo Jazzil to kind of do the Hope Florida Foundation's tax returns, and kind of figure out its finances, because its finances were a mess. It had gone years without maintaining a budget or doing anything else like that. This thing was basically kind of treated like a piggy bank, and he came in to do that. And there were questions about whether he was conflicted in that role, but we never found any evidence of what exactly was going on there.
What can the public do to remain politically engaged in this particular saga, to push for release of the grand jury presentment or hold public officials accountable?
Well, I mean, there are elected officials who are making these decisions. There's members of the legislature who held hearings and dug into it. The attorney general is involved here. There's, the state attorney is involved here in Leon County. And also I would say subscribe to your news outlets. I mean, all of us, Michael, Jason, Barbara, I mean, we all did critical reporting on this, and that costs money. This stuff does not come cheap. Subscribe, donate, whatever you can do and read, whatever you can do to support, outlets who are doing this kind of work, I think is really critical.
Yeah, I plus one to all of that. I would say if the goal here is to try and sort of pressure release or pressure some sort of meaningful change, the key is, like, your elected officials need to know that A, you are paying attention to this, and B, that you care enough to take action about it. So things you could do, you could email your state legislator or your state representative, your state senator, and ask them to demand the release of this stuff. You could show up, we're in the middle of a campaign now. James Uthmeyer and Ashley Moody are going to be showing up at a lot of public events. You could go to those events and raise questions, try and get questions answered, and make a big deal if the questions aren't answered. You just want people to see, the elected officials need to see that people are paying attention to this and they're actually engaged by it, and make sure, other people know about this. To Lawrence's point, like, it's so important to support journalism to help bring this stuff to light. But the truth is, still only a fraction of people see those stories. So making sure other people in your networks understand what has happened, who is responsible for what has happened, and sort of who's responsible for why we still don't have clarity or closure on this sort of stuff. Just sort of spreading the word that way is very valuable. But the most important thing to do is your elected officials need to know that you are engaged on this issue and you are motivated by this issue.
Yes, I would add that we anticipate that there is or soon will be an appeal of a final order that Judge Marsh has entered. Um, we do have some information that that process is underway right now, and we do plan to intervene further in any appellate proceedings, given that we were allowed to intervene and give our opinions about why uh, the closed court proceedings were wrong, why the report should be released, the history behind grand jury presentments. Grand jury presentments historically, as Jason pointed out earlier, have been a process by which the citizens of Florida hold government officials accountable. So we will continue to press for that release, uh, any appeal and any further appeals that occur perhaps in the Florida Supreme Court. Um, I'm afraid that we're at the very end of our time, and I want to, sorry, I didn't get to answer all the questions in the chat, but I want to flip it back to Barbara to close this out. And I want to thank everyone for your attention today and for appearing and for the great questions. And my panelists, Jason Garcia and Lawrence Mower, thank you both for your role and your reporting in this. Barbara?
Thank you, Michael. And again, thanks to Jason and to Lawrence. I have closely followed the Hope Florida scandal from the very beginning, and I learned a lot today. And I really do appreciate you taking the time, Jason and Lawrence, to make sure everybody understands the depth of what's happened and what is happening in Florida, and the secrecy surrounding this grand jury presentment. I mean, it's not just the presentment that's secret, it's all of the court hearings are secret, the dockets are secret. So following this is very difficult, and I'm really glad that we have Michael on our side because I don't think he sleeps and is always watching for us. And again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope you, like me, leave with an appreciation and an understanding of the importance of the media and the work of investigative reporters like Jason and Lawrence. It's entirely likely we would not have known about our government's nefarious and successful efforts to kill two citizen-driven constitutional initiatives. We wouldn't have known that but for their reporting. Equally important, of course, is the center's legal efforts. You know, first making public records requests, following through on those public records requests, and then filing motions with the court to intervene to try to make sure that ultimately the presentment is disclosed to the public. We're a very small organization, as I think you know, and I think you'll also agree we're extremely tenacious. And we're dedicated to ensuring government accountability and to enforcing Florida's constitutional right of access to government records. Um, Frequently, this feels like David versus Goliath, and uh, it's it's so critically important the work that everyone, every panelist, everyone in the audience, so important that we keep pressing, and to make sure that government releases the information we need to hold it accountable. If there's anyone you know who couldn't join us today, or if you'd like to share the Zoom with friends and family, as Jason and Lawrence suggested, there will be a link to the Zoom on the Trident website and on our YouTube channel. Um, the Florida Trident and the Center for Government Accountability are 100% donor supported. And I sincerely hope you'll lend us your support by making a donation so that we can continue doing this sort of work. We'll drop a link to our donate page in the Q&A section. It's easy to make a donation, and all of donations made to FLCGA are tax deductible. Again, thank you, and thanks to Jason and Lawrence and Michael for taking the time to give us their expertise and insights. And as always, a big thank you to our donors who make our critically important work possible. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. You can follow up if you have more questions with me or Michael via our email addresses or through the info at link on our website. And please help us continue this very good work. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.